My engagement party wasn't a celebration. It was a handoff, and I was the asset being replaced. It was the night I lost my fiancé, not because we had issues, but because I was traded, not by an enemy, but by my own father. I stood at the head of the room holding a champagne flute I hadn't poured, wearing a ring I hadn't chosen, thanking my father for teaching me how to make smart, practical decisions. The words came out steady, practiced, almost soothing. He had helped me draft the speech 2 weeks earlier, sitting across from me at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, crossing things out, rewriting phrases, nodding when I finally landed on the tone he wanted. Gratitude without emotion, respect without intimacy. I remember him saying, "This isn't about romance. Oh, this is about showing people you understand how the world works." I thought he meant adulthood. I didn't realize he meant compliance. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I was 32 years old when I stood there believing I had finally earned permanence. For most of my life, my father was considered a model of restraint, foresight, and quiet authority. The kind of man who always thought 3 steps ahead and never confused affection with obligation. To the outside world, he was respected. Inside our family, he was final. I wasn't raised to challenge him. I was trained to understand him, anticipate his expectations, and carry out his decisions with enough grace that no one ever had to question where the power actually lived. The engagement party itself was exactly what my father believed in. Tasteful, contained, impossible to criticize. No live band, just a pianist in the corner. No excess, no spectacle. The guest list was curated with the same discipline he applied to his business dinners: family, long-term associates, a few strategic friends of my fiancé's parents. Everyone knew where to stand. Everyone knew what to say. When people hugged me, they congratulated me on being chosen, on finding someone solid, on finally settling into something sensible. My father moved through the room like a host and a witness at the same time, watching reactions, noting alignments, managing optics. I didn't notice when he slipped away. Before the speeches, he touched my elbow lightly and reminded me to keep it short. "Thank your mother. Thank us. Thank him," he said, glancing toward my fiancé across the room. "Mention guidance. Our people like to hear that you listen." I smiled and said I always listened. He smiled back, satisfied. That was our rhythm. He had guided every major decision in my life under the language of protection. College, internships, where I lived, who I dated seriously, and who was just temporary. When I hesitated about the engagement, he said, "Stability first. Feelings follow." Standing there that night, I believed this was the payoff for all that discipline. I believed I was being rewarded. I gave the speech exactly as written. I thanked my parents for their support, for always helping me see the long view. I thanked my father specifically for believing in my future and steering me toward practical decisions that would last. There were nods around the room when I said that. Approval, validation. My fiancé squeezed my hand and smiled in a way that looked affectionate enough for photographs. The applause came easily. Glasses clinked. Someone joked about how calm I seemed for a bride-to-be. I laughed and said I trusted the process. It landed well. It always did when I said the right things. While guests lined up to take pictures, I noticed small absences that didn't register as alarms yet. My father wasn't in any of the group shots. Someone said he was taking a call. My fiancé disappeared for a few minutes and came back quieter, adjusting his cufflinks. My cousin, my younger cousin, the one people always described as striking, was suddenly everywhere, laughing too loudly, dressed more formally than necessary, her parents hovering close. She complimented my dress twice, each time ending with, "You look so composed." I thanked her. Or I had been trained to thank people when they observed my restraint. Upstairs, in my father's private study, the furniture was arranged the way it always was when he wanted control. Chairs angled, desk clear, windows closed. He had invited them there deliberately. My fiancé, my cousin, her parents, under the pretense of stepping away from the noise. He poured drinks he didn't offer me downstairs. He spoke calmly, professionally, like a man closing a deal he had already decided on. He described me as reliable, loyal, emotionally mature. "She's safe," he said, as if safety were a limitation. Then he pivoted, smoothly, to my cousin. "Prettier, better connected, more ambitious. An upgrade that made sense long-term." He assured them I would handle disappointment with grace because I always had, that I wouldn't cause problems. That I valued dignity over disruption. He laid out introductions he could make, capital he could unlock, doors that would open once the engagement ended quietly. He emphasized timing, optics, patience. He said the breakup shouldn't happen immediately. Let the party pass. Let the narrative settle. He spoke about my future as if it were already adjusted, already softened to absorb the impact. No one interrupted him. No one asked what I wanted. They didn't need to. He had already answered that question for me years ago. Downstairs, I moved from conversation to conversation, absorbing congratulations that now feel surreal in retrospect. People told me my father must be proud. People told me I was lucky to have such a steady influence in my life. I smiled and agreed. I posed for photos under a banner with our names printed neatly, unaware that the agreement it represented had already been voided. When my father returned, he kissed my cheek and told me the speech was perfect. "You did exactly right," he said. I believed him. That was the cruelty of it. I believed that doing exactly right would finally be enough. As the night wound down, guests lingered, reluctant to leave a moment that felt resolved. My fiancé stood beside me, polite, distant in a way I attributed to nerves. My cousin hugged me goodbye and whispered that she admired how well I handled everything. I told her it was just practice. My father watched us from across the room, hands folded, expression neutral. To anyone else, it would have looked like satisfaction. To me, it looked like trust. I thought he trusted me to step into the life he had helped build. I didn't know he trusted me to disappear without resistance. The party ended cleanly, no drama, no raised voices, just the quiet efficiency my father prized. As the last guests left and the lights dimmed, I stood alone for a moment, holding the empty glass, feeling the weight of a future I thought had been secured. Upstairs, the study door was closed again, the chairs returned to their angles, the deal already moving forward. While I was being toasted as the chosen one, my role had been reassigned, my replacement approved, and my gratitude carefully preserved for a plan I hadn't been invited to question. The email came years later, on a weekday morning that had nothing sentimental about it. No anniversary, no holiday, no trigger I could point to afterward and say I should have expected it. The subject line was neutral, almost apologetic, and the sender was a name I hadn't thought about since I left town. She had been my father's executive assistant for over a decade, precise and invisible, the kind of person who knew where every document was because she had put it there herself. Her message was short. She said she was cleaning out archived files before a system migration and thought I might want to see something. She added that she understood if I didn't respond. We met a week later in a quiet cafe near her apartment, both of us early, both of us careful. She didn't ask how I'd been. I didn't ask why she waited so long. She slid a tablet across the table and told me she had saved copies because something about it had bothered her at the time. "I assumed you knew," she said, not defensively. It just stating a fact she had finally revised. The first file was a calendar invite, dated weeks before my engagement party. The title was clean, professional, unmistakable, post-engagement alignment. I stared at it longer than necessary, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less deliberate. She scrolled without commentary. Attendees listed plainly: my father, my fiancé, my cousin, her parents. Location: my father's private study. Agenda attached. No euphemisms, no ambiguity. The meeting wasn't a reaction to something gone wrong. It was a planned correction. I felt a familiar sensation, pressure behind the eyes, but it didn't escalate. I had learned how to contain reactions early. That skill, it turned out, had been a prerequisite. "There's more," she said, and opened the email thread beneath it. And the timestamps confirmed what the title implied. This wasn't a conversation. It was an operation. The emails read like internal strategy, not family correspondence. My father wrote with the same tone he used in board discussions, referring to me by name, but never by relationship. He outlined strengths and limitations as if he were evaluating a hire he didn't intend to promote. "Reliable," he wrote. "Emotionally stable. Will not retaliate." Then, in contrast, a paragraph on my cousin's assets. Appearance, social reach, financial leverage through her parents. The conclusion was blunt. The long-term alignment favoured the alternative. The phrasing was clinical enough to avoid cruelty, which made it worse. Cruelty implied emotion. This was preference expressed through math. The assistant hesitated before opening the final document. She told me she had almost deleted it, assuming it was redundant. It was labelled Breakup Framework, Draft. I recognised my father's formatting immediately. Bullet points, spacing exact, tone instructional. The first line advised beginning with praise, my maturity, my understanding nature. The second suggested emphasising mutual growth and timing rather than dissatisfaction. A later bullet warned against mentioning money, influence, or my cousin by name. "Focus on alignment, not substitution," it read. There was even a note about waiting 2 weeks after the party so the optics wouldn't feel abrupt. I didn't need to imagine the conversation. I had lived it. She watched me carefully, as if expecting anger, grief, some visible response that would justify her decision to show me. I gave her none. And I asked a few clarifying questions instead, whether the meeting had occurred exactly as scheduled, whether any revisions had been made. She answered honestly. No changes, no objections. Everyone had agreed. When she apologised, I told her it wasn't necessary. She looked relieved, which told me how thoroughly my reaction had been predicted. Even now, years later, my composure was functioning exactly as designed. The realisation didn't sting. It settled. I left the cafe with copies of everything and no immediate desire to confront anyone. That urge had been engineered out of me long ago. As I reviewed the documents again that night, the details aligned too cleanly to dismiss. The delay before the breakup, the language my fiancé had used, almost verbatim. The emphasis on how well I was handling it. I had thought he was being considerate. In reality, he was following instructions. The humiliation wasn't the ending of the engagement. It was the precision with which my response had been anticipated and exploited. What stayed with me most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the confidence behind it. My father hadn't worried about fallout. He hadn't planned contingencies. He assumed silence because he had always received it. He assumed dignity because he had trained me to value it over truth. Reading his words years later, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. The speech I gave that night hadn't been gratitude. It had been proof of concept. Evidence that I would perform exactly as required, even when the performance erased me. I closed the files and archived them again, this time under my own system. And I didn't tell the assistant what I planned to do with them. She didn't ask. As I shut down my computer, there was no dramatic shift, no vow spoken out loud, just a recalibration. I finally understood that the worst part wasn't losing my place. It was learning that my place had always been provisional. The night of my engagement party hadn't been the moment I was betrayed. It was the moment the decision became official, scheduled, and quietly enforced without my consent. I did exactly what he said I would do, and that was the part he never questioned. When the engagement ended, I didn't raise my voice or ask for explanations that would have forced anyone to lie more creatively. I didn't ask why the timing felt rehearsed or why his words sounded practiced. I nodded when he talked about growth and misalignment. I listened while he praised my strength and maturity, the same words my father had outlined for him like stage directions. I told him I understood. I told him I wanted what was best for both of us. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. When it ended, I thanked him for being honest. The cancellation unfolded with the same efficiency as the engagement party. I contacted vendors with polite emails that took responsibility without assigning blame. Change in circumstances, I wrote. No further explanation required. I returned gifts with handwritten notes that expressed appreciation and regret in equal measure. When relatives called, I reassured them before they could reassure me. I said it was mutual. I said we were still on good terms. I said these things calmly enough that people repeated them on my behalf. Within weeks, the story stabilized into something clean and acceptable. The engagement had been right at the time. It simply hadn't lasted. No villains, no mess. My father watched the process from a distance, offering support that didn't require him to adjust anything. He told people I was handling it well. He told me he was proud of my composure. When I thanked him for being there, he accepted it without hesitation. There was no moment where he tested the boundaries, no visible concern that I might deviate from the script he had written. He trusted the outcome because he trusted me to absorb the cost. That trust was the most revealing part. It meant he had never seen my restraint as a choice. It was a feature he relied on. The gossip arrived quietly, as it always does. Friends of friends reached out with sympathy that doubled as curiosity. Or some asked if I'd been blindsided, others suggested I must have known something wasn't right. I didn't correct any of them. I let assumptions settle where they landed. My silence gave people room to invent narratives that protected everyone involved. It was easier for them to believe the ending was mutual than to consider the alternative, that it had been managed. I had no interest in educating them. The truth wasn't useful yet. It didn't need witnesses. Leaving town felt inevitable, not dramatic. I framed it as a reset, a chance to refocus on work somewhere less familiar. My father supported the decision publicly, telling people I needed space to recalibrate. He said it with the same tone he used when describing a strategic pause in negotiations. I packed without ceremony, keeping only what I needed. There were no tearful goodbyes, no final conversations that would have suggested permanence. Everyone assumed I would come back eventually. That assumption was part of the structure. It allowed them to move on without resolving anything. From a distance, I watched the rest of the plan unfold exactly as outlined. My cousin and my former fiancé appeared together at events within months. Always careful, always understated. There was a period of plausible deniability that my father must have approved. When the engagement was announced, the reaction was muted but supportive. People commented on how well matched they looked, how natural it seemed. My cousin reached out to me once, sending a message that thanked me for being so understanding. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings because none of it would have worked if I'd made it difficult. I didn't respond. There was nothing to clarify. They married quietly, but not modestly. The guest list was selective, the setting expensive. My father stood beside them with the ease of a man who believed the outcome justified the process. My former fiancé stepped into the world my father controlled with visible relief. His career shifted quickly, opportunities opening that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with access. I understood then that the marriage wasn't the reward. It was the dependency. He had traded autonomy for security, and my father had arranged it that way deliberately. Dependence was easier to manage than loyalty. Meanwhile, my life elsewhere took shape without announcement. I worked longer hours than necessary, not out of desperation, but because no one was monitoring my trajectory anymore. Every advancement was earned without commentary, every mistake absorbed without family intervention. I built credibility slowly, in rooms where my last name meant nothing. That anonymity was instructive. It stripped away expectations I hadn't realized were weighing me down. I didn't correct people when they underestimated me. I let results speak. Over time, they did. Promotions followed, influence accumulated, not loudly but steadily enough to matter. Years passed before I returned for anything that resembled a family event. By then, the narrative had hardened. I was the one who had left, the one who had chosen distance. My father's version of events positioned him as patient, respectful, quietly disappointed but supportive. No one challenged it because there had never been a confrontation to dissect. Silence had preserved his authority. When I finally walked back into that world, it wasn't as a daughter seeking reconciliation. It was as someone whose absence had been misinterpreted as irrelevance. The room adjusted in small ways I didn't comment on. My father greeted me with practiced warmth, his confidence intact. He asked about my work without curiosity, assuming updates would be modest. I answered accurately but briefly. He nodded, satisfied, already categorizing me where he thought I belonged. What he didn't know, what no one there knew, was how closely the next phase of his life would intersect with mine. He still believed he had managed the situation cleanly years ago. That belief had calcified into certainty. He had no reason to suspect that the daughter he once described as safe and limited had been quietly positioning herself somewhere he could not control. As the evening progressed, conversations turned to his latest venture, the one he spoke about with rehearsed optimism. He hinted at financing that hadn't yet been announced, smiling as if the outcome were inevitable. People listened. They always had. I listened too, noting details, recognizing patterns I now understood from both sides of the table. When he mentioned a potential partnership that brushed close to my professional orbit, I said nothing. I let the moment pass. There was no advantage in correction yet. He was still operating under the assumption that I would behave exactly as predicted. And that assumption, unchallenged, untested, was the most valuable thing he had left. I returned for the family event because my name was already on the program. Not as a daughter, not as an apology, as a professional. That distinction mattered, and even if no one else recognized it yet. The venue was familiar, one of those places my father favored because it signaled permanence without excess. He believed settings like that conveyed authority by association. When I walked in, conversations didn't stop, but they softened, recalibrated. People adjusted their posture. A few looked at me twice, registering something they hadn't updated in their mental files. I didn't rush to correct them. I took my seat, reviewed the agenda, and waited. My father took the stage later than planned, confident enough to let anticipation work in his favor. He spoke about legacy, about momentum, about the importance of family values in sustaining long-term ventures. It was a speech I could have outlined myself, having grown up absorbing his cadence. Then he shifted, casually, all to the announcement he had been saving, a major deal, nearly finalized, dependent on financing that, according to him, was all but secured. He smiled when he said it, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. The pause was intentional. He wanted the connection noticed. He framed it as reconciliation, joking that family always comes back together in the end. Laughter followed, polite and relieved. He hadn't told me beforehand. That was either arrogance or faith in my predictability. Perhaps both. By positioning me publicly, he assumed I would fall into line rather than disrupt the narrative he had already launched. He expected gratitude. He expected discretion. He expected access. When the moderator invited me to comment, the room leaned forward in a way that felt almost physical. This was the moment they believed would close the loop. I stood, thanked them for the invitation, and said I wouldn't be participating in the deal. My tone was neutral, professional, uninflected by emotion. It took a few seconds for the words to land. My father smiled at first, assuming clarification was needed. He gestured lightly, as if to say we would discuss details later. I didn't sit down. I explained that my firm had strict ethical guidelines regarding conflicts of interest, particularly those tied to undisclosed personal history. The phrasing was deliberate. It gave him an opening to redirect, to minimize. He didn't take it. Instead, he laughed softly and said, family history was hardly a conflict. He invited me, publicly, to elaborate. That was the mistake. By pressing, he shifted the burden of silence from me to himself. So I clarified, slowly, so there would be no misunderstanding. I said that years earlier, an organization under his leadership had negotiated my replacement at my own engagement party, without my knowledge or consent. I said that documentation existed confirming the timing and intent. I said that as a result, I could not ethically partner with any venture he led. The room went quiet in a way that felt structural, as if something essential had been removed. No one interrupted. No one laughed. The words didn't echo. They settled. I didn't look at him while I spoke. I addressed the investors directly, the people whose confidence was now recalculating in real time. Questions followed immediately, not from me but from others. Requests for clarification, concerns about governance. My father attempted to respond, but the authority he relied on required disbelief, and disbelief had evaporated. He denied nothing outright. He reframed. He spoke about context, about misunderstanding, about private family matters being misinterpreted. It didn't work. The details mattered now. The timeline mattered. His inability to fully deny was louder than any admission. Investors exchanged looks. Someone suggested postponement. Someone else cited reputational risk. The deal, which had existed only because everyone believed it would, began to unravel. I sat back down when it was clear my presence was no longer required. My role had been fulfilled. The collapse continued without my participation, accelerated by the vacuum where his certainty used to be. He had built his influence on the assumption that his narrative would go unchallenged. Once that assumption failed, the structure couldn't hold. Younger relatives watched silently, absorbing the shift. They didn't rush to defend him. They didn't look at me for guidance either. They were recalculating their own positions, quietly, the way I once had. The aftermath wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The deal was suspended pending review. The investors left early. Conversations fractured into smaller, more cautious clusters. My father didn't approach me again. He didn't have language for this version of events. Legacy, once exposed as conditional, doesn't recover through explanation. It recedes. Over the following months, his influence diminished in ways that didn't make headlines but mattered deeply to him. Calls went unanswered. Introductions stalled. The authority that once protected him thinned out, revealing the limits beneath it. The consequences rippled outward. My cousin's marriage, built on advantage rather than trust, strained under scrutiny it had never anticipated. My former fiancé, financially dependent on a network now under question, discovered how fragile borrowed security can be. Within the family, alliances shifted without confrontation. Younger members reached out to me privately, not for comfort, but for alignment. They didn't need my approval. They needed distance from a model that had finally failed publicly. I left the city the next morning without ceremony. No victory speech, no follow-up explanations. I had said everything that needed to be said, once, in the room where silence had protected him for decades. That was enough. On the plane, I reviewed the same documents I had archived years earlier, then closed the file. And they no longer had leverage. The truth had done its work without embellishment. I hadn't taken anything from him directly. I had simply declined to carry what was never mine to bear. In the end, the cruelty of that night years ago had been its confidence that I would remain manageable, grateful, replaceable. The revenge wasn't loud. It was structural. I didn't dismantle his world out of spite. I stepped aside and let it fail its own test. When I finally stood where he could no longer speak for me, I proved the one thing he had never believed, that the future he traded away didn't need his permission to arrive. Some betrayals don't explode, they're scheduled. Subscribe for stories where restraint isn't weakness, and patience always gets the last word.